Okay, so I just felt really called to share my story of basically everything unusual, metaphysical, spiritual, paranormal that has occurred for me up until this point in my life. The reason being, I guess, is just that part of it is just challenging myself to express my truth, and to put myself into that place of vulnerability and I guess just radical honesty. And I believe at this point in time it's just so important that as many of us do that as possible, because I really do believe that the only way we're going to heal this crazy messed up world is through vulnerability, transparency, authenticity, just being radically honest. So and I guess also it helps me hearing other people's stories and their sort of epiphanies and revelations. And so I'm also putting this out there just for anybody who might get something out of it, even if that's just to know that you're so not alone with all this crazy stuff that's happening. So not alone. Like, there is so many of us going through all this crazy stuff. So where to begin? So what I'm hoping to cover, there's so much stuff, and it starts right back from my childhood. I guess from when I turned 8, that would, and in fact my family history, because that all ties into it as well. Basically all of my psychic and paranormal and spiritual experiences. When I was 8, that was the first significant event that I guess opened the doors to that world. And then, so I will talk about different hauntings, my psychic abilities, contact with crossed over beings, and then what closed the door on all of that, because there was a while where I shut the door on all of that world. But during that time I also had my first experience of samadhi, or like full presence enlightenment, after going through probably one of the darkest points in my life. And then how becoming really physically ill, and nearly dying from that illness, and going through what possibly was a soul swap at that point, led me back to my intuition, and how I made the choice to open the doors again to all of that stuff. And then what followed, which was out of this world and way crazier than what I could have expected. And then how that led me on to find a whole lot of truths, and then from there how then I went on to meet an incredible soul called Arikala before she passed away mysteriously after only getting to know her for a short while. And then from there, how that then seemed to then open the doors yet again into the next experience, which was meeting my other self and experiencing what at the time I didn't realise, but appears to have been a Kundalini awakening. Sorry, I've got a bubba, so and 2 elder children, so I think all these stories are going to be very discombobulated. Whee! And hopefully they'll make some sort of sense. But what I mean by meeting my other self was that what I have been guided to understand is that there is a phenomenon which I had no idea about, but where you can meet yourself, your own soul, in another human. The soul can split itself to be expressed in 2 human bodies simultaneously, and most people will term this the twin flame phenomenon. I don't really like that term because I think that the majority of the information out there is really, it really misinterprets it, and it romanticizes it, which takes away from the whole purpose that it's set to fulfill, and can become really, really toxic. There's this whole toxic cult world out there around this twin flame phenomenon. But yeah, luckily I was guided to the information from Kurt Johnson, I think his name is, from All Star World Order, which is his to the New World Order. And he just explains it in just with an ancient Zen spirituality philosophy. Just really simplifies it and brings it back down to earth, I guess. So I prefer his term, that it's just the other self phenomenon. And so I'm still kind of going through that, and that was really incredibly disorientating, but I'm finally feeling like I am used to this wild ride. I mean, I say that, maybe I'm just going through a settled patch, but I thought while I was in this more settled patch that I would start to tell my story, get it out there for anybody who may get something out of it, even if it's, just to feel that you're not alone, just to see how many of us are going through all this completely wild stuff at the moment, and that you're not crazy. So just to introduce myself, my name is Amelia, and I am a mind-body spirit coach. My business is made of stardust, and so I help people get to the root cause of their physical and mental and emotional states of imbalance. And I particularly focus on the underlying mineral dynamics. I'm a trained root cause protocol consultant, and I utilize a energy psychology modality called Psych K, which just means mind key, which is just about accessing the subconscious mind so that you can quickly resolve trauma and sort of stress perceptions, and reprogram the mind with empowering beliefs and sort of weed out those limiting beliefs. And so I'm also mother of 3 beautiful children, and I live in the Blue Mountains in Australia with my husband. So my husband and I separated last year, during my crazy spiritual experience, but at the moment we're just cohabitating until we can find a better solution that's going to be good for all of us, including these kidlets. So it's all pretty amicable, but definitely has its challenges. So where to begin? I guess oh man, I don't know how to make it make sense, everything that I've got to say, but hang on. Okay, it probably won't make sense. It probably won't have any meaning for a while. And you have to excuse me. I have my Mars in Gemini, so I have a bit of a verbal diarrhea problem. But hopefully I'll get to some points. Okay, so I grew up in a very chaotic and dysfunctional family home. So both my parents had a lot of emotional baggage and trauma. My mum grew up in New Zealand, and while she says like her childhood, you know, nothing terrible happened, but it was just the way there was just kind of no emotional connection in her family home, and it was like everybody was miserable, but her mum she was happy as long as everything was neat and tidy. And you know, she grew up through a time when babies were left to cry. I mean, I suppose not much has changed, but it was pretty intense back then. And she also just feels that she probably had a really traumatic birth, and then she was separated from her mother. So in many ways I have taken on a lot of her generational trauma, even though often I also don't know exactly where it came from, how it originated. But it's been a huge challenge in my life having a mother who was really anxious and withdrawn from me a lot. We're fairly close now, but yeah, during my childhood it was definitely a massive challenge. We fought a huge amount, and I was a really wild, strong-willed, and emotionally turbulent child. And so then I had a father who was basically an absentee father, and when he was around he wouldn't know how to deal with me and my brother either, and he would repeat the words and the patterns of his messed up father before him. And just to give a little bit of background into his upbringing, his father was from Wales and his mother, I think she was from Ireland, and their family home was in Mossman in Sydney. And so basically his dad, who I'd always heard referred to as Old Sid, he was a professional boxer. And I think for the earlier part of their childhood, he was fairly sane. He was relatively sane, and I think he could be a fun dad, perhaps. My dad was the eldest, so he might have seen that side of him a little bit more than his younger brothers, but I think it must have been early in my dad's childhood. Sid was in the car with a friend, and something happened and they had a massive crash, and the car flipped, and his friend was killed, and Sid apparently shattered like basically every bone in his body, and just had enormous brain damage from that. And so he apparently he had to spend about 18 months in hospital, and when he came back, he had like severe PTSD and just brain damage that just radically changed his personality. And so my dad has told me stories that basically at times Sid could be his old self. I think he still played the cello and he loved poetry, and he would bring kittens home for the boys. I know how much my dad and his brothers loved those cats. But then he had his dark side, which was really just totally paranoid, psychotic. So he would, he had his shotgun and he'd wake them up in the night thinking that they were invaders and demanding that they, you know, tell him who they were, and he would not believe them when they said, like, we're your sons. And oh, the trauma that put into those boys. And so then another thing was with the shotgun that he had, he'd take them out into the bush to do target practice. Crazy thought to me now, like in the middle of the bush in Sydney City. But, well, what is now more of a built-up city, like a very built-up city, sorry. But he would, when they were out there, he'd like bring out matches and force the boys to do things like, I think there'd be those cross spiders out in webs throughout the bush, and he'd get them to do things like light the matches and then light the spiders on fire, and then force them to sit and watch. And they were all really sensitive boys. Like, these are, yeah, very sensitive, gentle souls. And so they couldn't stand it, but he'd then threaten them with the gun that if they didn't sit and watch the spider or light the spiders on fire, that they weren't man enough and that he'd shoot them. So just such a toxic childhood. And he'd do things like he'd be sitting there happily playing the cello, and the boys would be playing with the kittens, and then out of nowhere his mood would just suddenly change, and he would stand up, go out to the shed and bring back an axe and just pick up the cats and the kittens and just like hack their heads off in front of the kids. And then he kept my grandmother, he'd lock her up in her room. He had all these bolts on the doors, and she wasn't allowed to leave the room. And then he used to like to go off and play chess in Hyde Park in Sydney. And while he was out, it was my dad's job as the eldest son to like patrol the room and make sure that his own mum wasn't allowed out of this room. And then that sent my grandmother mad, completely mad. She became an alcoholic, and then she fell pregnant to her youngest son, and Sid didn't want the baby, and so he forced her to take some sort of abortion drugs, but too late. So unfortunately the youngest brother, he was sort of a little bit, not too badly, but a little bit mentally retarded and sort of tiny bit physically deformed. So yeah, my dad's way of coping was basically when he was supposed to be at school, he'd go off and go and watch horror movies, and to him what he was seeing on the screen was nothing compared to the horrors at home. And so to him it was just like hilarious, which obviously a lot of horror movies are, but you know, he got into some pretty seriously disturbing stuff which warped his perception on what is appropriate. So a lot of my childhood he wouldn't understand what was appropriate for children, and so we were shown some pretty interesting movies when we were very, very young, which probably has added to my deliriously fucked up mind. But I went to visit my uncle maybe a few years back, and he was telling me a bunch more stories about my grandfather and about the boys' upbringing, and it's almost just like it's got to be made up. It's so bad, and I mean tragic, just absolutely unbelievably tragic. His girlfriend said to him, "Oh, come on, like, why don't you tell us some of the good stories? Like, there were good times. There were some good times in your childhood. Surely you can think of some of the good times." Because she knows that he's very messed up, and tends to focus in on all the trauma, I guess, in that kind of trauma loop that happens in his mind. And he just told us a story about how not only was his dad nuts, but apparently the neighbour was nuts, and at some point he says he remembers that the boys were all playing with their mates, and they had all these firecrackers ready to go off, and the neighbour just appeared out of nowhere and told them all to shut up, and said that if they let the firecrackers off he'd kill them. And so then he apparently just picked up a brick and threw it at my uncle's head, and it missed him. Like, it just got him on the side of the head, and my uncle said that if that had hit him in the head, like, he'd probably be gone. And so then this neighbour stole all the firecrackers, he picked them up off the kids and ruined their night, and then he took them off to his car and sat in the car and killed himself, and all the kids witnessed this. So their childhood is just like mind-blowingly awful. And so yeah, the girlfriend had said to him, why don't you just tell us some of the good stuff? And so he was telling me, you know, like they lived, when they were in Mossman, I think there was like a ferry wharf nearby, and they and where I don't know, shipping containers and different things came in, and at some point they apparently they were shipping in like lion cubs and things for Taronga Zoo. So the boys got to go down and like touch the lion cubs through the cages, crates sort of things. But he was saying that like they had all these beautiful beaches, and I think originally they lived a little bit further away. It's still all Middle Harbour area, but originally they lived in somewhere near Ryde, and so my uncle was talking about the good times and saying, you know, one day they were down there with the family and they were having a beautiful day, and then he just starts telling me about how all of a sudden this woman screamed out, and her partner went down to help see what was going on, and she'd been bitten on the calf by a shark, and the shark was trying to drag her out into the like into the deeper water, and the partner was trying to, you know, fight the shark off, and then it let go, and then it got her thigh, and she was dragged out of the water, and then apparently they were there while they all watched her. I think she bled to death after like 20 minutes or something. So that was a nice day down at the beach for those boys. A little bit of an escape from the family home. But yeah, it's just like the trauma. It's just unbelievable. It's hard to believe that much can happen in some people's lives. And I mean, my dad also has stories. Once he'd moved out of home, he was living in an apartment, and a little boy fell out of the window, and he had to run down. He found the body. Just, yeah, just crazy, tragic, crazy, crazy, crazy. And so, safe to say that my dad was pretty messed up. And he would unfortunately have a lot of the dark traits that his father had, just learnt behaviour. And so Dad would always say to me, "What's wrong with you?" And then he'd leave. Anytime we were upset as kids, and I was particularly emotional and loud and strong-willed, and yeah, anytime I was struggling with my big emotions, rather than having an adult there to help me regulate, I was just told, "What's wrong with you?" and have him leave. And so to him, the family home was a very threatening place, and because of what he experienced in his childhood. And so, oh, and I forgot to say that in the end, well, not the end, that after, you know, many years of all this madness, my grandmother then killed herself in the shower, and then my dad's youngest brother found her, so then he turned alcoholic, and then he drank himself to the grave. He died in 2015 after an incredibly tragic life. He used to work at a hospital in the city, where he'd have to take the corpses from the hospital down to the morgue, and he'd often get stuck in this rickety old elevator with these corpses, and then he had this really steep hill to have to push them down on the stretchers, and the stretcher would often go out of control, and the corpses would fall off, and he'd have to pick these now damaged corpses off the floor, and get them back up onto the stretcher by himself, and get them down to the morgue. And then when we looked at my father's family tree, we found that we came from a family of undertakers, and they owned a funeral home or something. So I feel like there's this sort of theme of death and darkness through a lot of my family history. And so perhaps it's no wonder that I maybe have been open to the experiences that I've had. But anyway, I was quite the wild child, and so but Mum wouldn't know what to do with me, and Dad was never around, so Mum would I would be very, very, very destructive and violent, and so not knowing what to do with me, she would lock me outside. And then I used to get so furious and I would punch through the glass and then climb back in through the broken glass of the door. And so I have a lot of scars on my hands and things from that. And when I was visiting my uncle, he didn't realise that I ever did that. And he was telling me this story about how one night he'd had this really disturbing dream. He was seeing his father when he was younger with his family, and so they grew up in a Welsh slum, and you know, his dad had also a really, really hard poverty-stricken sort of upbringing. And he said that there was some sort of fight going on or something, and Sid got locked outside, and then Sid punched through the window, and then came back in through the window. And my uncle said that he just woke up completely just shaken by the energy of this dream, and like just how much anger my grandfather had. And then the reason why he was telling me was that he then spoke, I think, yeah, so he dreamt this while his father was still alive, and he told his dad about this dream, and apparently his grandfather confirmed that was something that happened in his childhood. So I was completely like mind blown by that, and told my uncle about how I used to be locked outside and punch through windows. And I don't know that many other people, I have not met that many other people who have had that kind of a situation in their life where they punch through windows. I don't know, is that a common thing? I don't know. But then once I started working as a health coach, one of my first clients, he was telling me about traumatic experiences in his life, and one of those was that he'd been locked outside and he punched through the window to get back in. So maybe it is a common thing, or maybe it's just that whole thing of you know, the law of correspondence, that you just attract the things that reflect yourself and where you're at and your experiences.
So I had to break the window, it just had to be. Better that I break the window than him or her or me.
So that was kind of where I came from. My dad's friends would often come and say to me, you know, I think a lot of what goes on in the home in terms of like the ghostly stuff is actually your dad's trauma. It's like the energy of your dad's trauma, because it did seem to center a fair bit. Well, it centered around me, but he was the only other one who was aware of what was going on, and a lot of it happened. My mum and dad split up when I was well, actually I don't even know how old I was, maybe 10? I'm not sure. I don't know, maybe, no, must have, well, it probably happened when I was about 7. And yeah, because I'm pretty sure they went together once all the ghosty stuff started up. But anyway, my dad was the only other one who seemed to be aware of what was going on. We both seemed to experience it. And oh, that's so, because they'd split up, my dad, we had like a 3-story house, and dad basically started living up in the attic, and my brother and I slept in the middle floor, and then mum slept down in the sort of front part of the house. And so a lot of what would occur, I would have a lot of experiences up in the attic. I was terrified to go up into the attic. but then a lot of stuff would happen on my level of the house, centering around me. I'll talk a bit more about my ghostly stories in the next video, but just to talk about my upbringing a little bit more. Yeah? Cool. Still got half? Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So you can eat them now or later. It doesn't matter. That's all good. Cool. But yeah, so as a toddler, we lived out in the bush, and I would just roam free and completely naked. And I remember my dad telling me about how once there was a taxi driver dropping him home, and he caught a glimpse of me and was like, oh, that's that wild girl that everybody speaks about. He wasn't sure if the wild girl even had parents, and I don't know whether Dad told him that that was his daughter. But yeah, I remember walking through the bush in the middle of summer and just getting covered in cicadas. And I mean, you know, there was snakes and spiders and everything, but obviously I was in some way protected, perhaps just by the fearlessness of a child, being a child. And so what I remember was Mum was very creative, but very unconventional. She was like a textiles artist, and because Dad's father, old Sid, had made him feel that he was just incompetent, Dad grew up then being incapable of like most practical, common sense sort of tasks. And so yeah, he just went fully into his intellect, and you know, he's a very very intelligent man, but it meant that Mum would have to be the one to like mow the lawns and set up the tents when we go camping, and like fix things and do all the handyman sort of jobs around the place. And she didn't necessarily ever know what she was doing, but she'd always just give it a go and somehow fumble her way through it, and often get quite good at things. I remember a family friend once describing my mum as this sort of strange free spirit who'd like walk all the way to the shops and then finally only realise that she didn't have her wallet on her at the checkout, but then somehow out of nowhere just pull enough like spare change out of her left sock to be able to afford whatever it was she needed at the time. And so yeah, she's quite the sort of anarchist, just very chaotic, but yeah, I guess that's been quite challenging to me, because she likes to rush into things without getting her ducks into line, whereas I'm just like the total opposite. And so she's always stressed me out and pushed my buttons there, because yeah, I definitely tend to like to overanalyze and overplan, and unfortunately have suffered with a lot of like perfectionist tendencies, which is sort of the energy that my soul is really needed to move out of in this life. So I understand why I would have a mother like that. But much of my childhood, like I don't remember my parents being around. I tell stories sometimes and Mum's just like, what? Where was I? Where was I when this was happening? I don't know, Mum. And so yeah, while it was difficult not having parents around, it did mean that I, you know, was able to just live in this very free, sort of magical fairyland type existence with hours and hours just to get lost in my imagination and just out in nature. And so Dad worked like far away from home. He was an educator at different jails and correctional centres. and he'd mostly just stay in the city rather than coming home. But yeah, when he was home, he'd pretty much always just have guests over, and the people that he brought home were like extremely eccentric. So just anytime he was around, the house would just be full of mad people. We'd have like his geeky eccentric chess club, playing chess late into the night. I remember like trying so hard to get to sleep, and just the smell of like cigar smoke coming down the hallway, and hearing the like those little chess clock things being switched over and over and over again. And then like by the time I finally get to sleep, all of a sudden I'd just be woken up to like one of his friends going, "Jimmy!" out of nowhere. And there was no one at those meetups called Jimmy. And then like I'd finally get to sleep again, and then I'd hear, "Jackie!" And so yeah, we had like magicians and crop circle enthusiasts and schizophrenics, and he'd bring up like ex jail inmates, just all kinds of people, homeless people, the works. And so actually I remember some of the best times of my childhood were being babysat by this totally like completely insane woman, but she was so like spontaneous and just fun, just like so much fun. And she'd take us on like these crazy adventures and just make everything just completely magical for us, with just so much enthusiasm. And strange things would happen when she was around. One time she came to visit and she took us out just walking around the streets and through the bush and everywhere, and down in the gutter we found just like an old washer, and she quickly like leapt down and grabbed it and said, "Oh look, a washer, you make wishes with these. Now all we have to do is find a wishing well." And I was thinking, yeah, we're not going to find a wishing well around here. Like, it was my neighborhood and we basically lived in the bush, and I knew it pretty well because I spent my childhood wandering around, roaming through the area. And then as we were walking, like we're walking through the bush, and there's another washer just lying in the bush. And so she took us up through the bush in a direction that I actually hadn't ever gone, and we came up to this big open like field, sort of lawn of somebody's property, and there up near the house was a little water well. And this woman came from the city, and this was the first time she'd visited us, and I had no idea how she knew to just walk up through the bush and find this wishing well. And so we went up and we're about to throw these washers in the well, and all of a sudden she's like, "Oh, hang on guys, wait, we haven't had breakfast." And so she said, "Quick, quick, quick, make your wish, and we gotta go home and we're gonna make chocolate brownies. We need to make chocolate brownies for breakfast." And so we threw our things in and made our wishes quickly, and then we all ran home and made chocolate brownies. And then every time she'd come up, somehow we would just find washers, and like we would never find those any other time. But then she just disappeared off the face of the earth, and we just sort of lost contact with her, didn't really know where she'd gone or what had happened to her. And once I was grown up, I was about 20, and I was just like reflecting back on this, how this woman was like one of the best parts of my childhood, and how strange it was just to think that, like, I don't even know whether she's alive or where she is, what she's doing. And so I wrote this very goofy, silly song. I was just mucking around at that point, learning how to, you know, record music into my computer and things. And then the weird thing was that she showed up after I recorded this song, she showed up at my parents' doorstep 2 weeks later, and she stayed overnight, and they just set her up with a mattress on the ground, and then all these slugs came inside and they all came up to her bed. So there was all these snail and slug trails all leading to this mattress, and then they all must have gone away in the night. But that was the weirdest thing. So I'm not sure. Definitely strange things would happen around her. But yeah, anyway, as a child I really hated school, and I just never felt like I fitted in anywhere. And during that time, like, Mum just tired of her broken relationship with my dad, and she ran off with another man who we all hated. So that was really hard. And I just remember like spending so many years wanting a mother around to help guide me through growing up. But I often just couldn't reach her. Like, she still lived at our place, but she just wasn't there very often. And then Dad wasn't around much. So I ended up having to take on kind of like a lot of the cooking and the cleaning. I was probably the only person in the house who cared about cleaning. And yeah, just kind of like taking care of my little brother, and having to walk up to the shops to buy things if I found that there was no food in the house. And then I do remember at some point Dad becoming very, very unwell, and the doctors actually said that he was going to die. And so he'd spend most of the time just in bed, but out of nowhere, like, he would just appear in a rage and like go out the back and light a fire and just start throwing all of our drawings and belongings and things in this fire, or he'd just go out to the balcony and just throw all our stuff off the balcony out into the bush, which as a child, that was really stressful and traumatic. But yeah, apparently that was something that his father did as well. Apparently my grandmother spent years and years working on a book that she was writing about Vietnam, I think. And apparently she even had letters of like correspondence with Nelson Mandela. And finally, once she'd almost completed her book, my grandfather just stormed in one day and just grabbed it all, and grabbed her letters and everything, and went out the back and threw them into the fire. And I remember my uncle telling me about this, and just how painful it was to watch her, you know, fall to the ground, just crying and not being able to do anything about it other than like watch it all burn. So yeah, so we relived those past traumas then with my dad, and he would sometimes get violent. I remember being dragged through the house like by my hair up some stairs and then into the bathroom, and him like forcing my head under blasting cold tap as punishment for whatever little thing I did, and like being thrown down onto like hard wooden furniture, almost having my spine snapped. I think he thought I'd hidden his glasses, which I hadn't, and he crushed me so hard that I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't talk. I couldn't tell him that I couldn't breathe, and he was telling me that he wouldn't let go until I told him where his glasses were, but I couldn't even speak. And luckily he let go just before, I'm sure, I would have passed out in just, you know, a second more. And then Mum would slap me and throw plates at me and all these wonderful fun things. So yeah, that was pretty ugly, pretty chaotic and messy, painful. wonderful. But yeah, I see now that my soul came here for like many lessons, and it's led me on a path to discover like just the beautiful connectedness of this divine universe, and this messy human experience that we find ourselves in. It's like I always wanted to experience magic, and I would always play that there was fairies and gnomes, and always secretly hope that I get like a little letter left or some sort of message when I was a tiny little girl. But yeah, I wanted magic, and I don't mean you know, dark, creepy, out of control feeling hauntings, but like beautiful guidance and synchronicities and like messages just from something that's bigger than I was. But yeah, I grew up and I had to face what I thought was the cold hard fact that it wouldn't happen, and that I was alone, and that this was a cold, harsh universe. But yeah, I never expected that it would all open up to me, and especially not at this age. It's kind of like it was after coming through the other side of my Saturn return. Life is just, it's like another reality. So anyway, as they say in YouTube land, like and subscribe if you're keen to hear my story. And I'll catch you guys next time for some of my ghost stories.
We didn't know which road to take, we didn't know which way to go, so we made our way from roly-poly hill and up and down and back and forward and round and up and through and down and upside and down. And it didn't really matter cause the sun was still high and we still had time for a few more finds. You found a washer, said now we need a wishing well, a wishing well. I said are we gonna find a wishing well around here? I don't think we're gonna find one. Who are you? Where are you now? Who are you? Where are you now? We didn't know which road to take, we didn't know which way to go, so we led the way through the bushy creek and the green grassy fields and the wombat hole and the flower beds and the pebbly path and the fence and the pile of coal. And it didn't really matter cause the sun was still high and we still had time for a few more finds. You found a wishing well, said oh